coming on the air with what could be a bigger bill for you at the end of the month for new car and home loans, credit cards. All of it's going to cost more now that the Federal Reserve is raising interest rates by 0.5% for the first time since we were all sweating out Y2K. But the markets, they're having their best day since the pandemic started that month, March 2020. We're going to break down why this is all happening and what this rate hike means for your budget. Plus, Democrats say they want to codify the protections of Roe versus Wade into law after that leaked Supreme Court draft opinion, even though they know they don't have the votes to do it. We'll talk about what they're planning to do next and the new research on maternal health risks if Roe is overturned. Plus, the EU's biggest move yet to punish Russia. How? By banning oil imports. That whole thing might be on hold, though, because some countries say they just can't get by without the oil. We've got those details, and we'll introduce you to some special ops veterans training up Ukrainian fighters. We're also hearing for the first time from Amber Heard herself as she gets her chance to take the stand against ex-husband Johnny Depp. Why she is saying today that leaving him is the best decision she ever made. Plus, the FDA is still about a month away from approving a COVID vaccine for kids under 5. And for some parents, that moment cannot come soon enough. But some of them say they feel left behind by the new normal. My conversation in tonight's original coming up later in the show. Hey, I'm Hallie, and right now we're starting with the economy. We're starting with something that I know you care about, which is your money, how much you have, how you can keep more of it. If you've invested it, look at the markets right now. They're up big time in reaction to the Fed's decision to raise interest rates by 0.5 percentage point. This is the second rate hike out of 7 that economists predict will happen this year. And it's the biggest rate hike since 2000, gang, when NSYNC was at the top of the charts and Netflix only had DVDs. The market kind of expected this, right? And look, we know it's not the end-all, be-all of the economy, but hey, Wall Street's pretty happy. The Dow Jones closed up more than 900 points. We also saw, as you can see, the S&P and the NASDAQ up too. So why is the Fed raising rates? It's being done to fight the number on your screen, that top number there, 8.5% inflation in March. You probably feel it, those prices rising. With unemployment at just 3.5%. The Fed chair says he doesn't want to get too aggressive, but Jerome Powell says he's still pulling out all the tools at his disposal to fight the long-term risk of a recession. He says he wants to help people now.
Inflation is much too high, and we understand the hardship it is causing, and we're moving expeditiously to bring it back down.
Okay, that's the long-term thing, right? Try to bring down inflation. But in the short term, check this out. Some things will get a little more expensive. Interest on credit cards, for example, new car loans, new home loans, those might end up affected, probably will end up affected from this rate hike. If you already have a mortgage, a fixed rate mortgage or a car loan or a student loan, you're probably fine. But mortgage rates are already high. They're already above 5%. NPR estimates that's already adding $370 to the monthly payment of a median priced home. Again, it's going to go up a little bit given this rate hike. Let's go now to Joel and Kent. So, Joe, talk through with our viewers. When the Fed raises interest rates, which makes our loan costs go up, how does that actually lower the price of everything else? Explain how this sort of arc works.
So you've seen the record demand, the massive spending. Maybe you're doing it yourself, right? All of that demand plus the supply chain crisis has really driven prices up and up and up. And the idea here is to make money more expensive by putting interest rates in the upward direction. And by having more expensive money, then that means the demand for stuff goes down. Then the prices, the consumer price inflation that we've been tracking at 8.5% right there, goes down as well. That is the hope. Now, the reason the markets went bananas today and the Dow closed up almost 1,000 points is that Fed Chair Powell came out and said, look, the next few rates that we're going to hike, or the next few hikes that we're going to do in the next few months, will be about half a point instead of that looming 3/4 of a point that a lot of investors thought would be too much, that might send the economy into a recession, the R word. And that is not what anyone wants. And that's the fine tightrope line that Fed Chair Powell and the entire Federal Reserve is walking right now. They want to cool off the spending, bring prices down without triggering layoffs that could lead to a recession. And that's really where the sweet spot is. It's a very big challenge to actually achieve that, though.
You call it a sweet spot, Joe. It's a fine line, right? And they're kind of at risk constantly of walking this tightrope. What's interesting here is, like, if you already own a home, if you're already paying a fixed rate mortgage, like your interest rate's going to be okay. You've been talking with people who would like to buy a home, right? But costs are going up. Mortgage rates are up. You know, the cost of, you talk about supply and demand in the housing market, it's kind of bananas right now in some places.
Yeah, it's bananas in a lot of places, especially in Nashville, Tennessee, where I met Andrew. And what he's trying to do, and what he did ultimately, was hurry up and lock in a lower rate before this second rate hike. This is what he said to me about what he just did.
I mean, the rates are going to go up, and, you know, the type of houses that we're looking at, the prices aren't really going to go down.
Now, the idea here is that he has already knew that he had to make an offer. I believe it was 8% over asking. So that in itself, plus a humongous down payment, was already going to be even more expensive than usual. Add on top of that any sort of rate hike, and then that affects the type of house that he and his family is able to purchase, as with everyone. So that's really what the housing market looks like right now. You know, last year we were looking at a 30-year fixed about 3%. Now we're well over 5.4% today. And imagine what's going to happen to that as this new rate hike takes hold. And one thing I want to mention, too, that the Fed did today, they were unloading money from their balance sheet as well. I know it's a wonky thing to talk about, but that's as significant as the rate hike that we're talking about. And so the idea here is that it's a two-pronged approach. And Fed Chair Powell saying, look, we are not close to a recession. He is putting it out there on the record, Hallie.
You know, you say it's wonky, Joe, but what it really is, these are tools. These are tools that the Fed has to try to get inflation down. Increase rates, right, do this rate hike, offload money on their balance sheets, which in plain English is like, you know, get more money out of the economy, basically. The president's trying to use one tool that he has, too, by saying, he's talking the economy today like everybody is, saying he's going to cut the deficit by $1.5 trillion this year. How much of a difference will that make, right? How much of a difference is that tool in the toolbox going to make for people who are looking at inflation going up?
It's not nearly as sharp of a tool as interest rates, and that's really the bottom line.
Jolyn Kent, pithy as always. Thank you for breaking it down, Joe. I appreciate you talking through what this means for consumers and all of us. Thanks. Turning back now to news here in Washington, with lawmakers on Capitol Hill putting this new plan in motion to codify the protections of Roe versus Wade. In other words, to make law abortion access protected in Roe, just in case the Supreme Court decides to overturn that decision. It seems likely, based on that leaked decision that has come out, bombshell, here in Washington and around the country less than 48 hours ago. With today, Democratic Senator Richard Blumenthal saying they'll bring a bill to the floor next week that would protect the federal right for women to have abortions. Here's the thing. This bill is pretty similar to the one that the House already passed in February, called the Women's Health Protection Act. Didn't pass the Senate. It got blocked, okay? And nothing functionally has changed since then. Democrats still don't have the votes because not all Democrats are on board with changing the number of votes you need for something to pass. So you'd think Democrats might be looking at the math. Senator Debbie Stabenow is. She's telling me today that they don't plan to give up on this. Watch.
This is going to be pretty tough to get to 60. So the question is whether or not we could get an exemption or not. And
do you think you can?
That only happens. That only happens if women across the country are weighing in with their senators, and both Republicans and Democrats.
Hallie Vitale, our congressional correspondent, is joining us now. And Hallie, what I think is important from Senator Stabenow there, and a thing that we talked about more, she was essentially saying, and I'm paraphrasing here, that if this draft decision that has leaked, that suggests a majority of justices are ready to overturn Roe sometime in the next 2 months, if that actually happens, right, and given this leak, she says, you know, basically people should be so outraged that they'll put pressure on their senators to maybe change some votes. And that could be a plan to get the math where Democrats want it to be. Is that the strategy here?
That might be the strategy, but you can put me in the skeptical camp, because I remember when voter pressure was supposed to turn the tides on Build Back Better. Obviously, this is a very different issue. This is an issue that was settled precedent for 49 years, and that for now millions of American women and childbearing people, they're having to grapple with what this potential reality could look like. That could be energizing, but it's an untested theory here. And when you look at the landscape in the Senate, yes, they are still expected to vote next week. They've changed a little bit of the language in the Women's Health Protection Act, so it's slightly different than what it was in February, but the stakes and the landscape here are not. They still lack the votes for it to go anywhere.
Senator Lisa Murkowski, the Republican from Alaska, who's been one of two key Republican senators, both women, Senator Susan Collins is the other one, who have been vocal about their support for abortion access, who are also Republican. I know that you and our team caught up with Senator Murkowski today, and she said she's still looking at this. Yeah. She didn't sound super committal. Let me play it so people can hear it.
I am told that what he is, or what he will be introducing, is different than what was introduced. And so I would actually like to see what changes, if any, have been made to that.
So then what are other Republicans? Again, she wants to see about any changes. She's going to look at it. She's not committing to it. What are the other Republicans saying about this?
Right, because we're looking at Murkowski here, who leaves the door open or closes it a little depending on what side of this issue you're on here. But the other Republican who's potentially up for grabs on this is Susan Collins, always the two Republican women who we're talking about when we talk about reproductive rights here. They have their own bill that they are pushing. It's different from the Women's Health Protection Act in that it's more narrowly tailored, and it leaves exceptions for not punishing providers who might have religious exceptions or religious objections to performing abortions. That's one of the key issues that's different in the bill that's the Women's Health Protection Act, but that's being helmed right now by Senator Blumenthal. That's one of the sticking points is there a way to take out language that could punish providers? The Blumenthal side of this, their reading of it is that their bill doesn't punish providers right now. They just want to make it so that it'll hold up in court. But on the Collins side of this and on the Murkowski side of this, that's a change that they would likely need in order to get on board.
Hallie Vitale, staying on top of this one for us. Hallie, thank you. We have to be clear here, right, that even if the court were to overturn Roe versus Wade, which it looks like that's the way that it's headed, given what we saw in oral arguments and then this leaked draft, it doesn't automatically ban all abortions nationwide, right? Remember, it kicks the decisions down to the states. And right now, there are 13 states. You see them on your screen, these 13 in yellow here, that have so-called trigger laws on the books. That means that abortion in those states would be banned almost immediately. We say immediately, like within a month, right? But it goes into effect as soon as that Supreme Court decision comes down. Tennessee is one of those states. Their trigger law, again, it's a month, 30 days, if and when Roe is overturned. It would make it a felony for a doctor to perform an abortion, but women would be exempt from prosecution. Some folks that our teams talked with seemed in agreement on one thing, that the leak of this draft decision itself was shocking. But on the issue of abortion access, as you might imagine, in Tennessee, as in much of the country, some divisions. Watch.
I'm actually happy that they're thinking about overturning this. I do not believe there should be abortions once that child is viable. It's really sad.
We don't expect men to get vasectomies or to use birth control. There's no requirement like that, and yet we put this kind of a requirement on a woman. I think it's wrong.
I want to bring in Kathy Park now. And Kathy, nationally, right, there is not as much support. More people support keeping Roe, keeping essentially abortion access in place. In Tennessee, fewer than a dozen clinics exist right now for women to get access to abortion. So what would the implication be in the state where you are and as you're talking with people about all this?
Yeah. Hey there, Hallie. So we looked at data provided by the Guttmacher Institute, and the average driving distance for a woman to get an abortion outside of the state of Tennessee is roughly 275 miles. And Planned Parenthood, they knew that this was coming because that trigger law that you mentioned earlier was enacted in 2019. So they hired more people, they trained them up, and they're so-called patient navigators. And essentially their job is to help women get access to abortion safely and legally if Roe v. Wade is overturned, Hallie.
Abortion is currently legal in Tennessee, obviously because of the federal protections there, but there are some restrictions that Tennessee has put in place, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Tennessee probably has some of the strictest abortion rules in the country, quite frankly. You mentioned the trigger law. That's just one of them. But there's something called an ultrasound law. And just like it sounds, it essentially requires a physician, a doctor, to show an ultrasound image and a heartbeat to an expectant mom. There's also something called an anti-discrimination law, banning abortions based on sex, race, and Down syndrome. And Tennessee also has a heartbeat law as well, and right now it's kind of hung up at the federal court system, but it's similar to kind of the national conversation that we're having when it comes to these abortion bans across the country. Hallie.
Kathy Park, live for us there in Knoxville. Kathy, good to see you. Thank you. So while a lot of Capitol Hill, of course, was focused over these last 48 hours on that issue, guess what? We're just learning now about something else related to January 6th. Somebody showed up virtually, I think, to speak with members of the January 6th committee. The former president's son, Donald Trump Jr. Happened voluntarily, happened over Zoom yesterday, a couple of hours. The source is telling our team that the discussion was, quote, pretty uneventful, in their words. No word yet from Trump Jr. or from the committee. But I want to bring in one of the folks who is reporting this out for us for NBC News, John Allen. Hi, John. Pretty uneventful for Don Jr. The committee had been wanting to talk to him for a while now. So it's significant that he showed up to testify about what was going down with his father on the days before and on the insurrection.
Yeah, and it's absolutely his side saying that it was pretty uneventful. We'll see what the committee has to say at some point. But yeah, the committee's been very eager to hear from him. Number one, because they know that he was communicating with Mark Meadows, then the White House chief of staff, trying to get then President Trump to stop the rioting. And they really want to know about that.
Because this came out in this raft of text messages that was reported from former Chief Mark Meadows.
Yeah, so there were all these text messages. We've seen some of them, and the ones from Donald Jr. basically said that he needs to go make an Oval Office address. He needs to stop these people. This has gone too far, is what he said. And so that's something the committee wanted to hear more about. Not just that, Donald Trump Jr. is very close to his father, very close to the base. They want to know about what did he do in the days leading up to that Stop This Steal rally that ended up leading to the attack on the Capitol, and certainly what happened in the aftermath.
How much are you reading into the fact that Don Jr. apparently has showed up now? And I say Don Jr. colloquially, Trump Jr., but people call him Don Jr., showed up without a subpoena because it was voluntary. He wasn't forced to do this legally.
Yeah, I mean, it would be interesting to see what he actually answered. One of the favorite answers. One of the favorite answers of all of these people is, I don't recall. And we know from having talked to members, I've been talking to members on this committee for several months now, I guess since it was established. We're hearing that a lot from the members, that they get a lot of I don't recall. So he may not have had to answer all the things that they wanted him to answer.
What do you think the most significant thing they were looking for from him was?
I think they want the state of mind of then President Trump. I think they're trying to prove that the then president was enjoying what was going on.
Interesting, we didn't hear about it until 24 hours after it happened, no?
Right, I know. It is interesting that it took a little while. And as you pointed out, it happened while this huge hubbub was going on over the abortion decision, the pending abortion decision from the Supreme Court.
John Allen, thank you for staying on top of that. Thanks for working your sources all the way right up until we came on the air. This was developing just right before we started the show.
Thanks, Hallie.
Thank you, sir. Also some breaking news as it relates to January 6th on some prosecutions. And a third member of the Oath Keepers, this far-right militia group, pleading guilty now, just this afternoon, to seditious conspiracy, and is going to testify, apparently, for the government. We're talking about a guy named William Todd Wilson. He's 44. He's from North Carolina. He's a veteran, used to work in law enforcement. NBC News has already learned that the FBI knew about Wilson last year, and today he's acknowledging in court that he conspired with somebody else, with Stuart Rhodes, to, in their words, oppose by force the lawful transfer of presidential power. In plain English, basically that he tried to falsely overturn the legitimate 2020 election. Stuart Rhodes, by the way, has pleaded not guilty. We're going to stay on top of that story, too. Turning now to the war in Ukraine, with the EU planning to totally ban all Russian oil imports by the end of this year. But that may be on the line. That may be a little bit in jeopardy because two countries, Hungary and Slovakia, they're not on board. They say they can't. They say they need this oil too much. It's basically what Hungary's foreign minister said today. Basically, their economy just cannot function without Russian oil. It comes after the head of the EU laid out a plan to stop importing crude oil in the next 6 months and refined oil by the end of the year from Russia. You might be thinking, okay, so what? Why does this matter? It's a big deal move because it's basically the EU putting some of their member economies on the line to a degree here and saying we support Ukraine, a very clear and direct message to Russia. It's a pivot away from their dependence on oil from Russia. Remember, Europe gets like a quarter of their oil, 25% of their oil from Russia. You see the rest of the breakdown here. It's a plan that could end up voted on by the end of the week. But to do that, you need all 27 countries in the EU to back it. And again, you got two of them, Hungary and Slovakia, that are pumping the brakes. Let me bring in Cal Perry, who is live from Ukraine, who's joining us now. Not a done deal yet, right, Cal? And even if it goes into effect, it's not like it has an immediate impact tomorrow or the next day or whatever. Talk through how you see this playing out and what we're hearing from Ukraine on this plan.
And look, I think what you're saying about not going into effect immediately is really important here. Even if you can get Hungary and Slovakia on board to stop, again, using Russian oil, it's possible they'll say, okay, but not until the end of 2023, right? That we need 18 more months in order to wean our economy off of crude Russian oil. And again, they break it down. They're talking about whether it's delivered by sea, whether it's delivered by pipeline. We heard the Czech Republic today saying, look, if it's delivered by pipeline, maybe we'll keep using that. We won't use other oil that's delivered differently. But you're starting to see, right, a breakdown in what we had 48 hours ago, which was this announcement that there would be this big embargo, that this would have a huge effect on the Russian economy. And let's not mistake it. Billions of dollars here are at stake in the Russian economy. And we heard from the U.S. Defense Secretary, General Austin, who was here last week, saying we want to cripple the Russian economy so they cannot rebuild their armed forces. It'll be interesting to see in the coming sort of week whether or not the European Union, led by the European Commission, can hang on to this alliance and actually put in some kind of embargo, Hallie.
Okay, so let's go from sort of the realm of economies and monies and signal sending to like practical fighting on the ground, right? Specifically what's happening in Mariupol, Cal, because we heard that there have been some civilians that managed to evacuate today, this steel plant that's been besieged there. But there are still people who are waiting to be rescued. What is happening? I don't even have my clock with me. I don't know what time it is there. I know it's late where you are. What's happening as we speak right now?
Okay, so as of right now, and we're getting hour-by-hour updates, it's shortly after midnight here. There was communication with fighters inside that plant earlier today. That communication then dropped, and it is now back up, according to the mayor. But the situation is dire. I don't know how else to report it than what we know, which is that you have this last holdout. And what seems to be the case, at least by Russian forces, is they're going to kill and or capture certainly the Ukrainian fighters that are inside that steel plant. And according to the mayor, they've made now a second push, and there's fighting in and around that plant area. Again, Ukrainian forces were able to hold them back up until today, and it now looks like that exact plant is about to fall. There is a greater concern for the 100,000 civilians that live in Mariupol, but again, a very small window opening for some people to evacuate today, but it seems grim, and it seems like it is now sort of approaching a conclusion.
There's also been, you know, I spoke with somebody today who sits on one of the supervisory boards for the railroad system in Ukraine. And this idea that over the last several days, Russia has really been going after some of these rail hubs, some of these electrical sort of stations, if you will, to try to make it harder for Ukrainians to move around weaponry, for example. There's this shift that Russia also, it seems, wants to be really marshaling its forces in the east, in the Donbass region, to solidify its gains there. Help us understand, you know, and that's, by the way, according to a senior U.S. defense official, help us understand where this fight goes next.
Yeah, it feels like we're opening a new phase here, right? There was a volley of rocket attacks across the country yesterday and today, as you said, targeting infrastructure, targeting power stations. The power was out in Lviv most of the day today. It's starting to come back sort of sporadically. These rail lines are so important for weapons to flow to the eastern part of the country to try to brunt this Russian advance. And then, as you said, Russian troops seeming to pull back from Mariupol. Again, I think a sign of how grim the situation is there for those last Ukrainian troops holding out, as Russian forces now sort of refocus their attention on the eastern part of the country. Look, the Russians said this was going to be phase 2, and it now looks like, as they put it, phase 2 is well underway, Hallie.
Cal Perry, live for us there in Kyiv, as you say, just after midnight. Cal, thank you very much for staying up for us. Appreciate it. Coming up, comedian Dave Chappelle, you heard about this, attacked during a performance. New today, what we're learning now about the person who jumped on stage with a weapon. And TurboTax, accused of misleading people with their ads for quote-unquote free service. We'll tell you just how much they have to pay now to their customers. Wait till you hear this number when we get back. Dave Chappelle saying today the show must go on after he was attacked on stage by a man with a weapon during a performance last night. Chappelle's spokesperson saying he is not going to let what happened overshadow, in their words, the magic of this historic moment, referencing some record sales the comedian had at the Hollywood Bowl. And today we found out police have arrested somebody. They got the guy they think is the suspect. Check it out. You can see kind of what happened from this social media video. Somebody jumps on stage, tackles Chappelle. I mean, that's pretty obvious, right? Pulls out this replica gun that could shoot out a knife blade. So it wasn't actually a gun, but it's like you pull the trigger, a little knife blade pops out. Officials say that the suspect here is being charged with felony assault with a deadly weapon. They're citing 23-year-old Isaiah Lee for this. All of this went down. Chappelle then gets back on stage with Chris Rock, who then jokes and says, was that Will Smith? Obviously referencing the moment that Will Smith smacked Chris Rock on stage at the Oscars. Miguel Almaguer is following this, frankly, kind of bananas story for us. And Miguel, so many pieces to this, right? So much of a spotlight has been put on security for shows ever since what we saw go down at the Oscars. This is the Hollywood Bowl. For people who aren't in L.A., this isn't like some backyard theater. This is like a very legit arena. How did this happen? What else are we learning today on this investigation from police?
Well, it's a really good question, Hallie. This bowl holds about 18,000 people, and it's a question that hasn't been answered. It appears the suspect had a ticket for the show, meaning he would have been required to go through security screening, which includes a metal detector. The weapon, as you mentioned, is a replica gun, which essentially looks exactly like a handgun, but has a knife or a switchblade that pops out of the barrel. How he got that through security is a big question tonight, and one that still needs to be examined.
I have to think for people, we're playing this, Miguel, I don't know if you can see it, but we're playing the video. We're sort of looping what happened because it is so extraordinary to watch this guy get on stage and tackle Dave Chappelle. People in the audience, I'm sure, were thinking, what in the world, right? Was this part of the show? It doesn't look like it. Some of these people are now talking to you and to others since they came out.
Yeah, totally. So there was a lot of chaos on the stage, and not everyone knew exactly what was unfolding. This happened at the end of Chappelle's comedy set, and Jamie Foxx even said he thought it was part of Chappelle's bit. Folks certainly seemed surprised, even shocked by what happened. Chappelle, as you know, is a major headliner, and there was confusion over how someone in the audience could actually get this close to him.
Hey, what is the Hollywood Bowl saying? Have we heard from them?
I'm sorry, Hallie, one more time?
The Hollywood Bowl. What are we hearing from them, from the arena?
So so they say that this is all part of the investigation. They, of course, manage security for the area, and they want to know exactly how this unfolded. They're not commenting publicly yet, other than to say they are reviewing this situation.
We talked about this whole, also that Chris Rock was there, defies the lot. You couldn't script it, you know what I mean, given what happened at the Oscars. We mentioned that thing, and since then you've seen some comedians, and you know this, living in L.A., they've come out and they've talked about concerns that audience members now at comedy shows might feel emboldened to attack a comedian for a joke they didn't like or thought was offensive. Dave Chappelle is certainly not a stranger to what people, some of them, consider offensive jokes. You know, this feels like it plays into a broader discussion right now happening in the world of performers out there.
Yeah, absolutely. For several months, Chappelle's been under fire from the trans community after the comedian made jokes that didn't go over well with them. After that attack, he seemed to reference that controversy that he's been a part of. He even joked that his attacker was a, quote, trans man. That's not going to help the current situation Chappelle is in. And, of course, as you mentioned, the bigger issue here, or one of the issues we should say, is just the security of comedians on stage and people feeling emboldened to attack them when they're live doing their thing.
You've been living in L.A. a long time, Miguel, and I know sure you go to shows, etc. We haven't really seen something like this to this degree, instances so close to each other before.
Yeah, that's right. We talk about the Oscars, right? That's very, obviously a very guarded situation. Everyone who's at the Oscars has been thoroughly vetted, and everyone knows who everyone is. This is a major venue, Hallie. You've probably been to the Hollywood Bowl before, too. It fits some 18,000 people, but up in the front row, fans are literally along the stage. They can rest their hands on the stage, and how someone could go from kind of this pit area, pick themselves up, run across the stage, and attack a comedian is a big question.
Miguel Almaguer, thanks for staying on top of that investigation for us, friend. Good to see you. Appreciate you being with us. Let's get you over to the 5 things now our team thinks you should know about tonight. Number 1, South Korean and Japanese officials say North Korea launched a ballistic missile this morning, not too long after Kim Jong-un said the country would try to boost its nuclear arsenal as fast as it can. Today's launch is North Korea's 14th weapons test just this year. Number 2, the judge overseeing Derek Chauvin's federal civil rights case has accepted his plea deal. This means Chauvin's going to end up sentenced to 20 to 25 years for violating George Floyd's civil rights. Of course, you'll remember that Chauvin, the former Minneapolis police officer, was convicted for murdering George Floyd. He's already serving a 22.5-year sentence. Number 3, Trump-backed candidate J.D. Vance beat out 6 others in Ohio's Republican Senate primary. If you're thinking, why does the name J.D. Vance sound familiar? He wrote Hillbilly Elegy. This best-selling book was turned into a movie. He was a former never-Trumper who then embraced the former president, who gave Vance his blessing. He won. He's now going to face off against Democratic Congressman Tim Ryan in November. Number 4, the parent company of TurboTax, they're agreeing to pay $141 million to customers who were misled by its ads. The settlement says Intuit tricked people into using its software for a cost and pulled them away from free services you could get federally. The money will go to 4.5 million taxpayers in all 50 states. Number 5, guess what? Looks like Dolly Parton is going to be inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame after all. We told you about a month or so ago that Parton said, hey, I really don't want to be nominated. This was back in February. She said she didn't feel like she earned it. She later changed her mind. And listen, Dolly's going to be in good company with the other inductees this year, Lionel Richie, Pat Benatar, Eminem. Good for Dolly. Coming up, experts say more women could face some serious health risks if Roe versus Wade is overturned. We've got to look at this new research with Dr. Kavita Patel to explain what this means for the U.S. maternal mortality rate. And in tonight's original, we're talking about how hard it's been for some parents in the last couple years of this pandemic, how the virus has forced families to make some tough decisions. Amber Heard took the stand in her own defense today, describing the abuse she says she endured while being married to her ex, Johnny Depp. We're going to have a look at that emotional testimony just this afternoon from inside the courtroom in just a minute. But first, experts are already saying that if the Supreme Court overturns Roe versus Wade, it could be a huge blow to women's health. And here's one of the big concerns. They're worried about an increase in maternal deaths. Right now, the U.S. already has the highest maternal mortality rate compared to any other developed country. If even more pregnant people cannot get the abortions they want or need, then this already frighteningly high number might get even higher, right? There are some other health problems associated with unwanted pregnancies. One study from the University of California found people who were denied abortions were more likely to have high blood pressure and seizures. And on the mental health front, a study out of the UK found that women who experienced unplanned motherhood were almost twice as likely to have psychological distress compared with women who planned it. Dr. Kavita Patel joins us now. And Dr. Patel, you talk about maternal mortality. I think it might surprise some people to hear that the U.S. already has such a crisis when it comes to maternal mortality. It's an issue that I've covered because it's so important to shine a light on it. Lay out the impact on those numbers if, in fact, Roe ends up overturned.
Yeah, Hallie, I'm glad you're covering it, and it's important to kind of frame where we are. So last year we had 861 deaths linked to maternity and labor. That is absolutely an undercount. But even in those numbers, Black women were 3 times more likely to die in childbirth or around childbirth. Then go to what the number of abortions have been. According to the CDC, in 2019, we had about 630,000 abortions, the majority of which were done at less than 13 weeks. Half involved procedures, and then half involved using pills. If you think then about having a healthy and successful pregnancy, Hallie, it comes with preparation. It comes with having your entire environment planned and ready for that pregnancy. So not having that option puts mothers in their early trimester at right when the fetus is developing their nervous system at the most risk for having a healthy pregnancy. And as you mentioned, it spills over into their entire life, including their children.
How about psychological distress, the idea of the mental health impact here?
Yeah, this is really a trauma. When you talk to, I used to actually administer kind of in Planned Parenthood and reproductive clinics on the border. I used to work with women who were denied for different reasons, procedures or having access. And the psychological trauma, you mentioned the UK study, we have US-based studies that also show those same proportions of mental health. But I think on top of that, it doesn't get enough attention. Often these women have other children. Often these women are in larger families. And that impact is a ripple effect. And we don't even talk about it. We focus on the mom, very important, but there's so many people this penetrates through, and evidence of trauma and mental health and distress, and also hard health outcomes, like you mentioned, hypertension, attention deficit disorder, on and on and on. And that's what I worry about.
Anti-abortion advocates that I've spoken to talk about the need to improve what they describe, some of them as the safety net for women who are pregnant, to support those women in states that may end up outlawing outright abortion if Roe is overturned. On the other side of things, abortion rights advocates, and you've seen signs like this on the Supreme Court even today, some of these demonstrations have said, you know, this does not eliminate the risk of illegal abortions, right? Even if you ban abortions, it doesn't mean that all abortions stop, only legal ones. How much of a threat is that?
Yeah, this is a threat. And what we can do to look at that is actually look at states now, not just Texas, Mississippi, but Oklahoma. We now have states that for years have actually made it very hard to get an abortion, states that only had 1 or 2 options for women who would have to drive 6 to 8 hours. And Hallie, there you did see some of the repercussions of not having health access. We have to think about this for what it is. It's women's health, and women's health is human rights in my mind. And so this is exactly, I think, the conversation that we should be having. And I think it's really important to tie it, as you did, this is health care. And that's really what's fundamentally at stake here.
Dr. Kavita Patel, thank you so much for being with us and for that breakdown. Appreciate it. Right before we came on the air tonight, we found out Secretary of State Tony Blinken, he has tested positive for COVID. State Department says he's vaxxed, he's boosted, he only has mild symptoms. But you know where he was this weekend? At the White House Correspondents' Dinner Saturday night. Apparently, a number of people who were there have tested positive in the days since, as NBC News is now confirming more than 1 million people in the U.S. have died from COVID since the pandemic started. The pandemic and COVID is also the focus of today's Original, our in-depth reporting on a topic we've been keeping an eye on. And it is one that we have absolutely been watching on this show, parenting during the pandemic. You've got some still waiting for the FDA to approve COVID vaccines for kids under 5. And for some families, the lack of this kind of protection means they're avoiding things like traveling a ton or socializing a bunch or going to busy places. They want to make sure their kids don't get sick. I spoke with some parents about this back in March. I want to share that story with you. Scarlett Prince Miller turns 5 this weekend, and she's been counting down the days for months.
She knows that once she gets the shot from the virus, she might be able to get on a plane and go visit her Auntie Em in Philadelphia.
But for Mom Megan, for now, life's looking limited. No planes, no indoor dining. So she feels abandoned by talk of a new normal.
There absolutely is no normal for a family that cannot get their child vaccinated who wants to. It is very, very real for us. At this point, we are being left behind in the pandemic.
Kids under 5 are not eligible to be vaccinated right now and won't be probably until June at the earliest. CDC statistics show they're at lower risk than other age groups, though the risk is not zero. People over 75, for example, make up 7% of the population, but account for more than half of COVID deaths. Kids under 5, 6% of the population, and 0.1% of deaths. The risk-benefit calculation looks different for different families. The Zerons, including 3-year-old Nico, are starting to open up their lives cautiously.
He looks at me and he says, you know, Mommy, is this safe? Can I do it? And that breaks my heart a little bit. So that makes me want to not be as risk adverse.
Do you feel like the CDC, the administration, as they're making decisions about returning to normal, have parents like you in mind?
It's been very confusing, quite honestly.
That confusion is partly why some parents turn to outside experts like Emily Oster, an economist focusing on parenting and COVID data.
This risk is small, even if it is very salient. And that's just a very hard thing to navigate.
What do you say to parents of kids under 5?
When people say, well, I'm not ready yet, I would encourage them to a little bit to say, what are you waiting for? What are the kind of next steps that you see that would let you move forward?
For some, it's the vaccine, even though only 1 in 5 parents of young kids say they'll get the shot as soon as it's approved.
Look at you.
Prince Miller will and has no regrets about the precautions she's taken so far.
Now, if you have to put on my gravestone, she was overly cautious in a global pandemic with regard to the health of her 2 small children. I'm okay with that.
When do you think you will get back to a new state of normal?
Part of me hopes it's like sooner rather than later, because I don't want my child to live in fear and have anxiety over things. But I think that it's going to take time for everyone just to get comfortable.
The new normal, for some parents, anything but. You know, Moderna is trying to be the first company to offer a COVID vaccine for kids 5 and under. They asked the FDA to authorize the low-dose shot just last week. The FDA is expected to make the decision probably sometime in June, which could mean shots in arms for the littlest kids as soon as this summer. Coming up, Amber Heard, the actress, telling her side of the story tonight in a defamation trial brought on by her ex-husband, Johnny Depp. The abuse she says she suffered during her marriage. Coming up. Plus, in tonight's Local, how the endangered California condor is making a comeback for the first time in 100 years. Still ahead, our Ken Delanian's talking with a group of veterans who are helping to train Ukrainian soldiers in their fight against Russia. We're going to have more inside what's being called Operation Mozart in a couple of minutes. But first, NBC News covers hundreds of stories every day. And because you couldn't possibly read or watch or listen to them all, our bureau teams have done it for you. This is what they tell us is going down in their regions in a segment we call The Local. From our Southeast Bureau, researchers have uncovered the largest set of cave figures in Alabama. Check this out. These are them. They used some really special photography for this. This stuff's big. Some of these pictographs, essentially, are something like 7 feet long. They're carvings created 1,000 years ago. They were almost invisible to the naked eye because of mud that just naturally built up on these cave walls. From our West Coast Bureau, for the first time in more than a century, California condors have been spotted flying over the northern coast. 2 captive bred birds were released at the Redwoods National Park, about an hour south of Oregon. A restoration project is helping the birds return to their habitat in the Pacific Northwest. You know, these condors from California have been endangered since the 70s because of poaching. And out of our Midwest Bureau, you can now get Chicago's tap water to go. If you want it, I guess. The brand is called Chicagua. And cans of the city's tap water will showcase different designs from local artists. It's really part of a new ad campaign from the city's mayor and from Chicago's chief marketing officer. They hope this is going to promote, in their view, Chicago's water quality. Turning now to news back here out of Northern Virginia, Amber Heard getting really emotional on the stand today as she defended herself in court in the defamation suit filed by her ex-husband, Johnny Depp. At one point, she talked about the first time that he allegedly slapped her. She says, listen.
I knew it was wrong, and I knew that I had to leave him. And that's what broke my heart, because I didn't want to leave him. I thought if I got up out of that room, I would leave the best thing that ever happened to me.
Heard described her relationship with Depp as intense during nearly 3 hours of testimony and said her ex would change when he would use drugs and alcohol. Depp has testified he never had Heard and said he's the abuse victim. He claims she punched and hit him several times. His attorneys rested their case yesterday after almost 2 weeks of testimony. Depp is suing her for almost $50 million. Heard is countersuing for $100 million. And before we get to Maggie Vespa, who's been following this trial, we want to warn you that some of the things we heard described on the stand today could be disturbing to some viewers. Maggie, she said it, and we said that she's intense, right? That's what this testimony was. A lot of people had been waiting to hear from Heard. Talk to us about what stood out to you the most.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you had that warning off the top, because honestly, our entire team was really struck by how graphic this testimony was, and also kind of the gradual escalation she described in this relationship. She testified the romance between Heard, herself, and Depp went from this kind of dreamy, intense whirlwind with like extravagant gifts and vacations to, she says, Depp slowly getting more and more jealous and angry. She gave examples of like when she would wear a low-cut dress, or if she booked acting roles, he would get angry. Then she said it turned violent with Depp punching walls, and then you heard that account of the slap, the first time that she says he hit her. That just aired. Several stories later, she gave this horrifying testimony about a 2013 argument, and once again, a warning here. Some viewers might find this disturbing, but here is that moment.
He rips my underwear off, and then he proceeds to do a cavity search. He said he was looking for his drugs, his cocaine, his coke.
We had a team of half a dozen people watching that. All of us were completely silent during that moment. Depp has said repeatedly he never abused Heard. Heard testified for hours today. Again, several stories that were graphic and disturbing. We are expecting her back on the stand tomorrow. And we should note at some point we can expect Depp's attorneys to cross-examine Heard, and they have not been shy, despite the graphicness of this trial, about airing Depp's allegations that Heard instead was the one who was violent. Showing this picture earlier today while cross-examining a psychologist called by Heard's team. That photo there from 2015 in Australia, you can see Depp on a stretcher with what he says was a severed finger because he claimed that Heard threw a vodka bottle at him again in 2015, severing that figure. And Hallie, again, Heard denies she ever abused her ex-husband.
It is a lot. It is a lot to process, right? And it is, as you mentioned, Heard is expected back on the stand tomorrow. And we've been talking about this for a few weeks. There are some other big names that are at least on the witness list, right? We don't know when they're going to testify necessarily, but you know, they're going to testify on behalf of Heard if they do. What's the expectation?
Right. Two of the biggest names that are getting the most headlines are Tesla CEO and now Twitter owner Elon Musk and James Franco. Both of them have connections to Heard. Franco and Heard started a movie together. Elon Musk and Heard had a relationship at one point that was talked about briefly in court today. They were on her witness list originally, but we're now hearing they are not going to testify. Reports citing Virginia law for non-residents that they don't have to testify in civil cases. They basically can't be compelled. Their camps have said not to expect them to testify. They're not exactly saying why.
Maggie Vespa, thank you for being on top of this for us. Appreciate it. We'll look for some more updates later in the week, too. Just a reminder, if somebody you know or if you are in an abusive relationship and you want to get help, call the number on your screen. There are people to help you. 1-800-799-7233. Coming up, still ahead, American veterans going to Ukraine to report on the conflict. But the mission changing fast when they saw how bad it was for themselves. How they formed a kind of special ops team to help train Ukrainian soldiers. We've got an inside story at that. Look at that, I should say, coming up in just a sec. The family of Trevor Reed, the former Marine held in Russian prison for almost 3 years, who's now back home. They are today asking the White House to bring back WNBA star Brittany Griner and Reed's fellow American Paul Whelan. All those families, that's Elizabeth Whelan right there, all those families were demonstrating alongside loved ones of other detainees as part of this Bring Our Families Home campaign outside the White House today. Trevor Reed's father had a message for the president: show more courage, in his words, and protect Americans. One of those Americans we mentioned, Paul Whelan. You see him here. He's been in Russia since 2018 on espionage-related charges, which his family and U.S. officials have denied. I talked with Trevor Reed's sister, his dad, and Paul Whelan's sister, Elizabeth, about what it was like to learn that one of them, right, Trevor Reed was coming home and Paul Whelan was not. Watch.
We asked him, like, physically, mentally, and he was like, I feel terrible that I'm here and that Paul is not.
Wow. I see the emotion on all of your faces in that story because I know how deeply this affects you.
So his first words were, why have I been left behind?
According to the Bring Our Families Home campaign, there are 55 Americans currently being held hostage or wrongfully detained overseas. Shifting now to another big story overseas, a group of American and British military vets asking for more help, specifically Stinger missile instructors in Ukraine. They're called the Mozart Group, a team of special operations veterans. They're training and equipping Ukrainian soldiers after seeing how devastating this war was for themselves. They've been teaching Ukrainians how to move in formation, how to clear mines, how to fire sniper rifles. Ken Delanian has more on this push, led by a British-born U.S. citizen who spent 31 years in the Marines.
Andy Milburn commanded a special operations task force fighting the Islamic State in Iraq. But the retired Marine colonel says he's never seen atrocities like the ones committed by the Russians in Ukraine.
I've seen a lot of devastation and depravity of mankind in war. Bucha was something that really, it left me numb for several days. Family vehicles, every occupant killed, not just one or two, not just because soldiers were trigger happy, but clearly targeted all along that road from Irpin to Bucha. It just left me with such a feeling of contempt and anger that I never felt for the Islamic State, for instance, was one of them. I never felt that for Al-Qaeda.
Milburn traveled to Ukraine in March, intending to cover the conflict as a journalist, but he quickly decided he needed to get involved.
It seemed as though just writing about stuff wasn't really at all satisfying.
He formed the Mozart Group, a team of special operations veterans training and equipping Ukrainian soldiers. The name was intended as a counterpoint to the Wagner Group, a notorious Russian mercenary organization.
As far as a full-time cadre here in country, it's probably around 10 to 15. It varies, but we rotate people through at any given time. We'll have about 50, 60 personnel in country, all of whom are volunteers, by the way, because we depend totally on donations.
They train Ukrainians in tactics and help secure them gear, but the Mozart Group doesn't fight.
But it's really important that we get guys in who are not adventurers. They're not here to get their gun on. They're here because because they have moral clarity. They see a purpose here, and they want to be here for that reason.
Milburn says he's seen little evidence that the billions in military aid authorized in Washington have reached the front lines, although Ukrainian officials say U.S. weapons have made a critical difference.
They're short of individual first aid kits. They're short of body armor. They don't have gloves, they don't have eye protection. They don't have ear protection. We saw a unit the other day where they evacuated 6 guys with ruptured eardrums in one day.
He's been impressed, though, by the bravery of Ukrainian soldiers.
There are guys who, with a handheld weapon like the Javelin or the N-Law or an RPG, knock out 2 or 3 T-72s in the course of a day and not even think it was worth discussing.
Milburn believes his team has made a difference.
I can tell you without any proof that I am confident that we have probably saved Ukrainian lives. I hope inflicted more pain on the Russians because of the training that they've had.
The Mozart group even rescued a dog named Richie.
And he was frozen and starved. He's still emaciated. We're trying to fatten him up.
Richie's hardest days may be behind him, but Milburn says Ukrainian forces are about to face their toughest challenges as the war concentrates in the east. And he plans to remain in the country trying to help.
Joining us now to talk more about this reporting. It's a great spot. Ken, talk to me more about, because this colonel, retired colonel, who seems pretty frustrated with what the White House is doing. What does he want?
You know, like a lot of people who have seen this horror up close, he wishes the United States could do more. And he has no patience for the claim by the Biden administration that certain steps would be escalatory. So, like, the Ukrainians have a wish list for weapons they don't have right now, like rocket launchers and ship-killing missiles. He wants all that to be sent to them yesterday. He wants the U.S. to be leaning further forward.
He says he hasn't seen much evidence of some of these American weapons getting to the front lines. Now, just because he hasn't seen it doesn't mean it's not happening, right? Billions of dollars have been spent trying to get some aid and some military aid specifically to Ukrainians. How does that? You cover national security, you cover everything related to sort of the defense sphere here. How can the U.S. know that the money that it's spending and the weapons that it's sending is getting into the right hands?
This is a question we are trying to answer right now, Hallie, and it's not an easy question. The Pentagon basically says, for the record, once the weapons reach Ukraine, we don't really know what happens to them. We don't quite believe that. There are people in the United States tracking this, but there are reports. We're talking to Ukrainian soldiers, our people in the field, and they're saying, I haven't seen an American weapon. So there's some inconsistency here, and we're trying to get to the bottom of it. Clearly, some of the weapons have gotten through. The Javelins have been very effective.
Right.
But is there corruption? Are there logistical supply chain problems? That's what we're trying to find out right now.
Ken Delaney, great reporting. Good to have you on set. Thank you for being with us. Appreciate it. And thanks to all of you for a busy hour and for joining us again. I'm going to be traveling and on assignment tomorrow. I'll tell you where on Friday. But Stephanie Goss will be holding it down as always. I'll see you right here, same time, same place on Friday. And on this show on Thursday. Coverage picks up right now.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.